October 14, 1943, 25,000 feet above Schweinfurt, Germany. Technical Sergeant Robert Bobby Mitchell pressed his face against the frozen plexiglass of his B-17's waistgun position, watching tracer rounds arc gracefully through the thin air, missing the approaching Focke-Wulf 190 by what seemed like 100 feet. The German fighter rolled away unscathed, its yellow nose mocking him as it banked for another pass. Mitchell cursed himself for leading the target exactly as he'd been taught in gunnery school, back at Las Vegas Army Airfield just 6 months earlier. Everything he'd learned about marksmanship, everything drilled into him since basic training at Keesler Field, Mississippi, was failing him catastrophically. In 3 missions over Germany, he hadn't hit a single fighter despite firing over 4,000 rounds. Neither had most of the other gunners in his squadron. The mathematics of failure were becoming undeniable. American bombers were being shot down at unsustainable rates, while their gunners were hitting almost nothing. What Mitchell couldn't know in that moment of frozen terror, was that 2,000 miles away in a collection of hastily constructed buildings at Eglin Field, Florida, teams of mathematicians, physicists, and ballisticians were completing revolutionary calculations that would transform the entire nature of aerial combat. Within 8 weeks, American gunners would stop aiming at German fighters entirely. They would cease trying to track individual targets through their sights. Instead, they would spray calculated patterns of bullets into predetermined zones of empty space, trusting mathematical probability over traditional marksmanship, statistics over skill. And they would begin destroying German fighters at rates that would shock even the most optimistic American planners and terrify the Luftwaffe High Command. The revolution that was about to overtake aerial gunnery would violate every single principle of marksmanship that had governed military shooting since Chinese alchemists first discovered gunpowder 1,000 years earlier. Forget about maintaining proper sight pictures. Abandon the steady squeeze of the trigger. Ignore the careful tracking of individual targets through your sights. Dismiss everything your instructors taught you about leading your prey. The new doctrine that was emerging from desperate necessity was heretical to traditional military thinking. Fire thousands of rounds into completely empty space where no enemy currently existed, trust the mathematical calculations of probability distributions, and watch German fighters fly themselves into invisible walls of lead they never saw coming and couldn't avoid. The crisis had reached its boiling point on August 17, 1943, when 376 B-17 flying fortresses of the 8th Air Force had set out in 2 massive formations to bomb the Messerschmitt aircraft factory at Regensburg and the vital ball-bearing plants at Schweinfurt. The mission had been planned for months as a decisive blow against German industrial capacity. By sunset of that terrible day, 60 bombers had been shot down, most falling to savage fighter attacks that had continued for hours. Another 95 aircraft were so badly damaged they would never fly again. Over 600 American airmen were dead, wounded, or missing. The gunners aboard the surviving bombers had claimed an astounding 288 German fighters destroyed, with another 27 listed as probables. Post-war examination of Luftwaffe records would reveal the actual number was between 25 and 27. American gunners were missing more than 90% of their claimed kills. They were firing thousands of rounds for every German fighter actually destroyed. Staff Sergeant William Crossman of the 100th Bomb Group, one of the few gunners to definitely destroy a German fighter that August day, wrote in his after-action report that would later be studied at length by operations researchers, "I fired at 12 different aircraft during the mission. I am certain I destroyed one. Saw it explode and the pilot bail out. The other 11, I might as well have been throwing rocks at them. My tracers followed them across the sky but never seemed to connect. It was like they were protected by an invisible shield. We're doing something fundamentally wrong." The roots of this catastrophic problem traced back to the optimistic interwar years when the Army Air Corps had developed its revolutionary doctrine of precision daylight bombing. American air power theorists, influenced by the Italian General Giulio Douhet and his prophecies of strategic bombing-winning wars independently, had convinced themselves that formations of heavily armed bombers could fight their way to any target and return without fighter escort. The B-17 Flying Fortress, first flown in July 1935 at Boeing Field in Seattle, had been specifically designed around this seductive theory. It would bristle with defensive armament, eventually mounting 13.50 caliber machine guns, creating interlocking fields of fire that no fighter could penetrate. The bombers would fly in tight defensive formations, their combined firepower creating an impenetrable hedge of bullets around them. It was an elegant theory, thoroughly war-gamed at Maxwell Field and the Air Corps Tactical School, that would cost thousands of American lives before finally being abandoned. Lieutenant Colonel Harold Bowman, who commanded the flexible gunnery training program at Las Vegas Army Airfield, had recognized the fundamental flaw in American gunnery doctrine as early as January 1942, just weeks after Pearl Harbor. In a classified report that wouldn't be declassified until 1972, he wrote with remarkable prescience, "We are training our gunners to shoot rifles at 300 yards when what they desperately need is to shoot shotguns at 30 feet. The entire foundation of our gunnery instruction is wrong. We're applying 19th century marksmanship principles to 20th century aerial combat. The boys we're sending to England are going to die because we're teaching them the wrong skills." Bowman had identified through careful analysis what physicists would later confirm through rigorous calculation. The speeds and distances involved in modern aerial combat had made traditional marksmanship completely obsolete. When a Messerschmitt 109 attacked a bomber formation from 12 o'clock high, straight ahead and slightly above, the combined closing speed could exceed 600 miles per hour. That meant the fighter was covering 880 feet every single second. A gunner had perhaps 2 seconds from the time he identified the threat until the fighter was past him and out of range. At those speeds, the human eye simply couldn't track fast enough, the brain couldn't calculate the necessary deflection quickly enough, and the trigger finger couldn't respond precisely enough to the rapidly changing situation. The mathematics of the problem were unforgiving and absolute. A Focke-Wulf 190 attacking from the classic 12 o'clock high position would cover those 880 feet per second. A .50 caliber bullet travelled at 2,810 feet per second at sea level, but at 25,000 feet, in air only 1/3 as dense as at sea level, its velocity and trajectory changed dramatically. The bullet had to arc through space while both the bomber and fighter moved in 3 dimensions at different speeds and angles. Factor in the bomber's forward speed of 180 to 250 miles per hour depending on loading and altitude, the gravitational drop of the bullet over distance, the wind resistance that changed with altitude and temperature, the parallax error between the gunner's eye and the gun's muzzle, which could be several feet apart, and the gunner faced a trigonometric equation with at least 14 variables that would challenge a modern computer to solve in real time. Technical Sergeant James Morrison of the 94th Bomb Group, who had been a high school mathematics teacher in Cincinnati before the war, spent weeks calculating these variables in his spare time. His notebook, discovered in the National Archives in 1987, contained page after page of equations attempting to solve the gunnery problem. His conclusion, written in frustration across 1 page: "We're asking farm boys from Iowa and factory workers from Detroit to be calculating machines. We're demanding they solve differential equations in their heads while being shot at. It's not just difficult, it's impossible." The first indication that something radically different might work came from an unlikely source in early September 1943. Master Sergeant Anthony Kowalski, a diminutive ball-turret gunner with the 91st Bomb Group based at Bassingbourn, England, had given up on traditional aimed fire entirely after his 5th mission over Germany. The ball turret, that plexiglass bubble hanging beneath the B-17's belly, was perhaps the most terrifying position in the entire aircraft. Kowalski would curl into a fetal position in this sphere, surrounded by ammunition feeds and hydraulic lines, with nothing between him and the 25,000 feet of empty air below but a thin layer of plastic. He couldn't wear a parachute. There was no room. And if the turret jammed, he would ride it down to his death. Perhaps it was this constant proximity to death that freed Kowalski from the constraints of his training. Instead of carefully tracking individual fighters through his reflector sight as he'd been taught, he had developed what he called the garden hose method. When German fighters approached his bomber, he would simply spray bullets in their general direction, walking his tracers across their anticipated flight path like water from a high-pressure hose, filling the air with lead and letting the Germans fly into it. His fellow gunners mocked him initially, calling him "Spray and Pray Tony." On September 6, 1943, during a maximum effort mission over Stuttgart, Kowalski's unorthodox method produced extraordinary results. In the span of 4 minutes, he shot down 2 Messerschmitt 110 twin-engine fighters and damaged a third so severely it was last seen trailing smoke and diving away from the formation. When intelligence officers debriefed him after the mission, Kowalski couldn't explain precisely how he'd done it. "I wasn't aiming at them in the traditional sense," he admitted, his thick Chicago accent making his words difficult for the Harvard-educated intelligence officer to understand. "I wasn't tracking them through my sight or trying to calculate lead. I was just filling the air where I thought they'd be with as many bullets as possible and letting them fly into it, like they were committing suicide on my bullet stream." Kowalski's remarkable success caught the attention of Major William Becker, a former MIT physics professor serving with the 8th Air Force's Operational Research Section. This unit, modelled on similar British organisations that had revolutionised anti-submarine warfare, applied rigorous mathematical analysis to combat problems. Becker had been analysing thousands of feet of combat camera footage, studying the geometry of fighter attacks and bomber defensive fire. What he discovered challenged everything the Army Air Forces believed about aerial gunnery. In a report dated September 15, 1943, classified Most Secret and distributed only to senior commanders, Becker wrote, "Our analysis of 1,247 combats between B-17 formations and German fighters reveals a disturbing truth. The most successful gunners, those who actually destroy enemy aircraft rather than simply claiming them, are not the ones with the highest marksmanship scores from training. They are not the ones who carefully track targets through their sights. They are, almost universally, the ones who fire the most ammunition in the shortest possible time, regardless of traditional accuracy. Traditional deflection shooting requires the gunner to calculate where the target will be and place a bullet precisely there. But what if, instead of trying to aim at where we think the enemy will be, we simply fill every place he could possibly be with bullets? What if we stop trying to achieve precision and instead pursue probability?" The theoretical breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Captain Robert Lindsay, a thin, nervous statistical analyst who had worked as an actuary for Metropolitan Life Insurance Company before the war. Lindsay understood probability in ways that traditional military officers did not. Insurance companies lived or died on their ability to predict aggregate behavior, even when individual actions remained unpredictable. At a meeting at 8th Air Force Headquarters at High Wycombe on September 22, 1943, Lindsay presented his revolutionary theory to a room full of skeptical senior officers. "Gentlemen," he began, his voice shaking slightly as he faced an audience that included General Ira Eaker, commander of the 8th Air Force. "Insurance is about managing probability, and so is shooting down German fighters. We cannot predict what any individual German pilot will do, but we can predict with mathematical certainty what German pilots in aggregate will do. They follow patterns. They approach from specific angles because those angles offer the best combination of firepower and survivability. They attack at specific speeds because physics dictates those speeds. They break away in specific directions because aerodynamics demands it. If we map these patterns statistically, we can predict not where a specific fighter will be, but where any fighter is most likely to be. We don't need to shoot down specific aircraft. We need to fill zones of maximum probability with bullets and let statistics do the killing." The room erupted in argument. Colonel William Hall, a West Point graduate who had been teaching marksmanship since 1928, stood up in rage. "This is absurd. You're asking us to abandon everything we know about gunnery. You're telling our boys to close their eyes and spray bullets like they're watering a garden. It's not just wrong, it's cowardly." But General Eaker, who had lost too many bombers to ignore any possibility, authorized a limited test. The Air Force would commission a comprehensive study at Eglin Field, Florida, where the vast firing ranges over the Gulf of Mexico would allow for controlled experiments. For 6 weeks in October and November 1943, technicians fired millions of rounds at radio-controlled target drones, mapping the probability distributions of successful hits under different firing patterns. They tested traditional aimed fire, where gunners carefully tracked individual targets through their sights. They tested barrage fire, where gunners filled predetermined zones with bullets. They tested distributed fire, where multiple gunners coordinated to create overlapping zones of coverage. The results, delivered to 8th Air Force Headquarters on November 28, 1943, were stunning and undeniable. Traditional aimed fire, where gunners carefully tracked individual targets, achieved a hit rate of 0.5%, 1 hit for every 200 rounds fired. Zone fire, where gunners simply filled predetermined areas of sky with bullets, achieved a hit rate of 4.2%, 1 hit for every 24 rounds fired. It was 8 times more effective than traditional marksmanship. The implications were staggering. Colonel Curtis LeMay, commanding the 305 Bomb Group and future architect of the strategic bombing campaign against Japan, immediately grasped what this meant. LeMay, who would later become famous for his ruthless efficiency, had no romantic attachment to traditional military methods. On December 8, 1943, exactly 2 years after Pearl Harbor, he issued a radical new doctrine to his gunners in a meeting at Chelveston Air Base. Forget everything you learned in gunnery school. When a fighter approaches, don't aim at him. Don't try to track him through your sights. Don't calculate deflection. Aim at the space in front of your bomber where he has to fly to shoot at you. Fill that space with bullets. Create a wall of lead that he has to fly through. Make him commit suicide on your bullet stream. The new technique was officially christened zone firing or barrage fire, though the gunners themselves had earthier names for it. They called it spray and pray, the garden hose method, or most commonly, filling the bucket. The concept required a complete reconceptualization of the gunner's role. Instead of thinking of themselves as marksmen, aerial snipers picking off individual targets, they were to think of themselves as human machine guns, probability weapons, statistical instruments of death. The emphasis shifted completely from accuracy to rate of fire, from precision to saturation, from quality to quantity. Second Lieutenant Arthur Goldman, a bombardier with the 381 Bomb Group who also manned the nose guns when not on his bomb run, described the psychological difficulty of this transformation in a letter to his wife that was passed by censors. Everything in your training, everything in your being tells you to aim at the enemy fighter. You see him coming, growing larger by the second, his wings sparkling with cannon fire. You want to track him, lead him, shoot him down specifically. Your brain screams at you to aim, but we're being told to ignore him completely and shoot at empty air where he isn't yet but might be. It feels insane. It feels like closing your eyes and giving up. But the mathematics say it works, so we're trying to retrain our instincts. The training transformation began immediately at the 6 flexible gunnery schools scattered across America: Las Vegas Army Airfield in Nevada, Buckingham and Tyndall in Florida, Harlingen in Texas, Fort Myers in Florida, and Kingman in Arizona. Since early 1942, these schools had been churning out thousands of aerial gunners every month, teaching them traditional marksmanship adapted for aerial combat. Now, almost overnight, the entire curriculum had to be revolutionized. Instructors, who had spent their careers teaching careful aim, were told to abandon everything they believed and teach statistical probability instead. Master Sergeant Frank Rodriguez, a gunnery instructor at Las Vegas Army Airfield, remembered the chaos of those weeks. We had kids, and they were kids, 18, 19 years old, who had been in training for weeks learning traditional marksmanship. We'd taught them breath control, sight picture, trigger squeeze, all the fundamentals that go back to the Revolutionary War. Then overnight, we're telling them to forget all that and spray bullets at empty air. Some of them thought we'd gone crazy. Hell, some of us instructors thought we'd gone crazy too. The curriculum transformation was comprehensive and radical. Out went the traditional emphasis on sight pictures and trigger squeeze that had defined military marksmanship for centuries. Out went the careful tracking of individual targets. Out went the patient waiting for the perfect shot. In came courses on probability theory that would have been more at home in a university mathematics department than a military training base. In came studies of German fighter approach patterns based on analysis of thousands of combat encounters. In came training on rate of fire maximization, how to keep the guns firing continuously without jamming them from overheating. The Waller Gunnery Trainer, a sophisticated electromechanical simulator that projected films of attacking fighters onto a screen while gunners fired electronic guns at them, was completely reprogrammed. Previously, it had rewarded accurate tracking of individual targets, giving the highest scores to gunners who kept their sights precisely on the enemy aircraft. Now it was modified to reward volume of fire in specific zones, regardless of whether an enemy fighter was actually in that zone at that moment. Gunners who filled their assigned zones with the highest density of fire scored highest, even if they never tracked a single target. The most counterintuitive aspect of the new doctrine was the concept of position firing, developed at the Central Flexible Gunnery Instructors School at Fort Myers, Florida. This technique, which would have seemed like madness to any traditional marksman, recognized a fundamental truth about the physics of firing from a moving platform. The forward motion of the bomber actually pushed bullets ahead of where the gun was aimed, an effect that increased with the angle of deflection. If a waist gunner fired directly at a fighter attacking from the 3 o'clock position, directly perpendicular to the bomber's path, the bullets would actually travel significantly forward of where the gun was pointing due to the bomber's own velocity of 180 to 250 miles per hour. The solution was so bizarre that many gunners initially refused to believe it could work. Aim behind the attacking fighter, sometimes by as much as 30 or 40 degrees. If a fighter was attacking from the 3 o'clock position, the gunner should aim at the 4 or even 5 o'clock position. Let the bomber's forward motion carry the bullets into the fighter's path. Trust physics instead of instinct. Staff Sergeant Leonard Morrison of the 95th Bomb Group, based at Horham in Suffolk, England, described his first successful use of position firing on November 26, 1943, during a mission over Bremen. This 109 came in from 3 o'clock level, and everything in my training, every instinct in my body, told me to lead him, to aim ahead of him like you would with a duck hunter's shotgun. Instead, following the new doctrine, I aimed behind him, way behind him, almost at our own tail. It felt completely wrong, like I was deliberately missing. I held the trigger down and watched my tracers curve forward through the air due to our plane's forward motion. The 109 flew right into them. The pilot probably never knew what hit him. His plane just came apart in the air. The mathematical foundation of these new techniques was codified in the November 1943 handbook Get That Fighter, classified restricted and distributed only to gunnery instructors and intelligence officers. This remarkable document, just 47 pages long, would revolutionize aerial combat. Unlike traditional military manuals filled with precise procedures and rigid rules, Get That Fighter read more like a physics textbook, complete with equations, probability tables, and statistical distributions. The manual stated bluntly in its introduction, "This book deals only with the shot when he is actually coming in at you." Past experience has shown that 90% of fighter attacks develop into this type of shot. Believe it or not, when a fighter is making his attack, you don't aim ahead as in other shots. Always aim between him and the tail of your own plane, because the forward speed of your plane is added to the speed of your bullet. The amount you aim behind is deflection. The handbook included detailed probability tables showing exactly where gunners should concentrate their fire based on the angle of fighter approach. For a fighter attacking from 12 o'clock high, the favoured German head-on attack, gunners should create a cone of fire 15 degrees wide and 10 degrees tall, centred on a point 50 yards in front of the bomber's nose. Every gun that could bear on this zone should fire continuously into it, regardless of whether a fighter was visible there or not. The mathematics predicted that a fighter attacking from this angle would have to fly through this zone, and if the zone was filled with sufficient bullet density, the fighter would be hit. For a beam attack from the 3 o'clock or 9 o'clock positions, the zone shifted dramatically. Gunners should aim 30 to 40 degrees behind the fighter's apparent position, creating a wall of bullets that the fighter would fly into as the bomber's forward motion carried the rounds ahead. The manual included detailed diagrams showing these zones from every possible angle, turning aerial gunnery from an art into a science. The impact on German fighter tactics was immediate and profound. By December 1943, Luftwaffe pilots were reporting a dramatic change in American defensive fire patterns. Major Gunther Roll, one of the Luftwaffe's top aces with 275 eventual victories, noted the change in a tactical report dated December 15, 1943. The Americans have abandoned aimed fire for area saturation. Individual bombers no longer track us with their guns. Instead, they create zones of fire that we must fly through to attack. Our standard attack approaches are becoming untenable. We are losing experienced pilots to what appears to be random fire, but is actually carefully calculated probability zones. The Germans were forced to adapt their tactics rapidly. The favoured head-on attack, which had been devastating against American formations in early 1943, became increasingly costly. Approaching from 12 o'clock high meant flying directly into the zones of maximum bullet density. Hauptmann Heinrich Bartels, flying with Jagdgeschwader 27, described the new reality in his diary. "You can no longer duel with American bombers as we did in the past. Before, it was a contest of skill, their gunners against our flying. We could outmaneuver their aimed fire, dodge their tracers, slip through gaps in their coverage. Now it's like flying into rain. The bullets are simply everywhere. There is no skill in avoiding rain." Lieutenant Colonel Adolf Galland, one of Germany's most successful fighter leaders, would later write in his memoirs, "By winter 1943, the Americans had discovered something we Germans, with our emphasis on individual skill and precision, had missed entirely. In modern aerial combat at these speeds and altitudes, statistical probability beats individual marksmanship every time. They turned their gunners into probability weapons, and we couldn't counter it with skill alone." The transformation of American gunnery training accelerated through the winter of 1943 to 44. By December, the 6 flexible gunnery schools were graduating 3,500 gunners every single week, all trained in the new zone firing techniques. The standardization was remarkable. A gunner trained at Kingman in the Arizona desert would use exactly the same techniques as one trained at Tyndall on the Florida coast. The curriculum had been reduced from 12 weeks to 6, with fully 2 weeks devoted entirely to understanding probability zones and position firing techniques. Traditional marksmanship training had been reduced to just 3 days, barely enough time to familiarize gunners with their weapons' basic operation. The human dimension of this transformation was profound. Young Americans who had grown up during the Depression, many from rural backgrounds where hunting was part of life, where a man's ability with a rifle was a measure of his worth, were being told to abandon everything they believed about shooting. They were being asked to fire at empty air, while German fighters bore down on them with cannons blazing. They were being told to trust mathematics over instinct, probability over skill, statistics over courage. Staff Sergeant William Patterson of the 379 Bomb Group captured this psychological struggle in a letter home. "They want us to be machines, not marksmen. We're supposed to fill zones with bullets according to mathematical tables, not shoot at actual targets. It goes against everything I learned growing up in Montana, everything my father taught me about hunting, everything that feels right. But the math works. More bombers are coming home. So we close our eyes to what we see and trust what the slide rules tell us." The effectiveness of the new tactics became undeniable during Big Week, February 20th to 25th, 1944, when the 8th Air Force launched Operation Argument, its most intensive bombing campaign to date. Over 6 days, American bombers flew 3,300 sorties against German aircraft factories in what would be remembered as one of the decisive air battles of the war. The bombers faced the full strength of the Luftwaffe fighter force, with the Germans committing every available fighter to the defense of these critical targets. Despite facing intense opposition, bomber losses were significantly lower than during the catastrophic October 1943 raids. More importantly, German fighter losses were catastrophic. The Luftwaffe lost over 350 aircraft, with 100 experienced pilots killed and another 150 wounded or captured. Many of these losses came from bomber defensive fire, as German pilots discovered that their traditional attack patterns had become suicidal. Technical Sergeant Raymond Johnson, a tail gunner with the 447th Bomb Group, shot down 3 fighters during Big Week without once specifically aiming at any of them. His after-action report read, "I just kept filling my assigned zone with lead whenever fighters appeared. I never tracked a single target, never put my sight on a specific aircraft. I just kept the triggers down and filled my zone. The fighters flew into it like moths into a flame. The psychological impact on gunners was complex and often troubling. Many felt disconnected from their successes, as if they hadn't really earned their victories. Staff Sergeant Paul Williams of the 96th Bomb Group wrote home in March 1944, "I shot down a Fokker wolf yesterday, but I don't feel like I did it. I was just hosing bullets into empty air where the mathematics said to shoot, and he happened to fly into them. There's no satisfaction in it, no sense of skill or accomplishment. We're not warriors anymore. We're probability machines." By March 1944, the Operational Research Section had analysed over 10,000 individual combat encounters between American bombers and German fighters. The data was overwhelming and undeniable. Bombers whose gunners used zone-firing techniques were 3.7 times more likely to destroy attacking fighters and 2.1 times more likely to survive their missions than those still using traditional aimed fire. Perhaps most surprisingly, the average ammunition expenditure per confirmed kill had actually decreased from 12,600 rounds to 7,800 rounds, as gunners were filling high-probability zones rather than chasing targets across the sky with long, ineffective bursts. The German response reveals just how effective the American transformation had become. A captured Luftwaffe document from March 1944, Tactical Directive 44-7, explicitly warned pilots. The American bombers no longer engage in aimed defensive fire as they did previously. They create zones of impenetrable bullet density at calculated points around their formations. Standard attack protocols must be abandoned. Pilots should seek isolated aircraft separated from formations or attack from angles outside the predicted zones. The evolution of American gunnery continued through 1944 with the introduction of computing gun sights. The K-13, developed by Sperry Corporation, and similar models from other manufacturers, were primitive analog computers that could automatically calculate the necessary deflection based on range and relative motion. These devices, technological marvels for their time, took the mathematical burden off the gunner entirely. Technical Sergeant Michael Pawlowski, using a K-13 computing sight in a B-17's tail position, described the experience in a letter that survived in his family's possession. "It's eerie and unnatural. You put the fighter in the crosshairs of your sight, but the gun fires somewhere else entirely, where the computer calculates the bullets need to go. The sight is doing math I couldn't do with pencil and paper in an hour, and it's doing it continuously, adjusting for our speed, his speed, altitude, temperature, everything. You're not shooting anymore. You're designating targets for a machine that does the shooting." The apotheosis of statistical gunnery came with the B-29 Superfortress and its revolutionary central fire control system. This system, developed by General Electric at a cost of over $100 million, more than $1.5 billion in today's money, took zone firing to its logical conclusion. Instead of individual gunners controlling individual guns, a central computer calculated firing solutions for all guns simultaneously, creating mathematically optimized zones of fire around the aircraft. The system was so sophisticated that it could track multiple targets simultaneously, calculate their probable attack paths, and pre-position guns to fill those zones before the fighters even began their attack runs. Gunners became sensor operators, merely designating targets for mathematical engagement by the computer. It was the ultimate expression of statistical gunnery. Human judgment replaced almost entirely by calculated probability. Major Robert Sterling, who transitioned from B-17 to B-29s in late 1944, was amazed by the transformation. In the B-17, we were manually creating zones of fire based on training and instinct. In the B-29, a computer does it automatically. It calculates wind speed, temperature, humidity, our speed, the target's speed, even the rotation of the Earth. It's not shooting anymore, it's applied mathematics. We've industrialized death itself. The impact extended far beyond mere tactics. The transformation of aerial gunnery represented a fundamental shift in military thinking, from individual skill to statistical probability, from craftsmanship to industrial process, from art to science. It presaged the computerized warfare of later decades, where human intuition would increasingly yield to mathematical calculation, where algorithms would replace instinct. The Luftwaffe's adaptation to American statistical gunnery drove further tactical evolution. By summer 1944, German fighters had largely abandoned close-in attacks on bomber formations, preferring to launch rockets from beyond effective gun range, or to attack stragglers separated from the defensive formation. This forced another American innovation, reconnaissance by fire, where gunners would spray bullets into empty zones where fighters might be lurking undetected, using ammunition to probe for threats that might not even exist. The culmination of the statistical gunnery revolution came during the massive bombing raids of early 1945. On March 2nd, during a 1,000-bomber raid on Dresden, the massed formations faced one of the last major Luftwaffe defensive efforts of the war. Using fully developed zone firing techniques, computing gun sights, and coordinated defensive patterns, the bombers claimed 67 German fighters destroyed. Post-war analysis of Luftwaffe records confirmed 41 actual kills, a claiming accuracy of 61% compared to less than 10% in 1943. The revolution was complete. The effectiveness of zone firing wasn't limited to American heavy bombers. Medium bombers like the B-26 Marauder and B-25 Mitchell adopted similar techniques with devastating effect. The U.S. Navy incorporated zone firing into its training for torpedo bomber gunners. Even fighter pilots began using statistical principles for deflection shooting, though the application was necessarily limited by their forward-firing armament. The international impact was significant. The Royal Air Force, initially deeply skeptical of American spray-and-pray tactics that seemed to violate every principle of British gunnery tradition, began incorporating zone firing into Lancaster and Halifax bomber training in early 1944. Soviet aviation, receiving technical information through Lend-Lease exchanges, adopted modified versions of American statistical gunnery for their Il-2 Sturmovik ground attack aircraft and P-2 medium bombers. Wing Commander Douglas Bader, the legendary legless RAF ace, observed the American approach during a liaison visit in March 1944. It offends every principle of marksmanship we hold dear. It violates everything we've taught since the longbow. But the Americans have proven that in modern aerial combat at these speeds and altitudes, mathematics trumps tradition. They've turned gunnery from an art into a science, and the science works. The psychological impact on German pilots was profound and demoralizing. Interviews with captured Luftwaffe pilots in 1944 and 1945 reveal a consistent theme. American defensive fire had become psychologically overwhelming. It wasn't the accuracy that broke their morale, but the sheer density, the impossibility of finding a safe path through the statistical storm. Franz Stiegler, the veteran Luftwaffe pilot who had famously escorted a damaged B-17 to safety in December 1943 in one of the war's most remarkable acts of chivalry, later reflected on the changing nature of combat. In 1943, you could still fight American bombers with skill and courage. By 1944, skill meant nothing. Their defensive fire had become so dense, so mathematically distributed, that attacking them was pure chance. You weren't fighting gunners anymore. You were fighting probability itself. Every attack became Russian roulette. The legacy of the zone-firing revolution extended far beyond World War II, influencing military technology and doctrine for decades to come. The principle of statistical engagement became fundamental to modern air defense systems. The Phalanx Close-In Weapon System, CIWS, used on naval vessels today, operates on the same basic principle developed by those B-17 gunners, creating walls of bullets in the predicted path of incoming threats, rather than trying to achieve precise hits on specific targets. Modern missile defense systems like the Patriot and THAAD calculate probability intercept zones, rather than attempting precise one-on-one interceptions. The Israeli Iron Dome system creates statistical interdiction zones to protect against rocket attacks. Every radar-directed gun system creating optimal burst patterns, every defensive system based on probability rather than precision, traces its conceptual ancestry to those American bomber gunners who learned to stop aiming and start trusting mathematics. Dr. Robert McNamara, who served as a statistical analyst with the 8th Air Force before becoming Secretary of Defense in the 1960s, reflected on the significance of this transformation in a 1962 interview. The zone firing revolution of 1943 to 44 was the first practical application of operations research to combat. We proved that statistical analysis could be more effective than individual skill. It was the beginning of systems analysis in warfare, the start of the mathematical approach to military problems that would eventually lead to computer-controlled combat systems. The human dimension of this transformation shouldn't be overlooked or minimized. Thousands of young Americans, raised on stories of frontier marksmen like Daniel Boone and Davy Crockett, taught from childhood that a man's skill with a firearm was a measure of his worth, had to abandon these deeply held beliefs and trust in mathematical abstractions they barely understood. They had to fire at empty air while German fighters bore down on them with cannons blazing, believing that probability would protect them better than their own aimed fire. Staff Sergeant William Crawford of the 379 Bomb Group, who flew 35 missions as a waist gunner, reflected years later in an oral history interview, "We went from being gunners to being probability implementers. It was hard to accept at first, shooting at nothing while Messerschmitts were coming straight at us with their wings lit up by cannon fire. Every instinct screamed at us to aim at them, to track them, to shoot them down specifically. But the math worked. More of us came home because we trusted the statistics instead of our instincts." The training infrastructure reveals the massive scale of this transformation. Between December 1941 and August 1945, the Army Air Forces trained approximately 176,000 flexible gunners, along with tens of thousands more in other gunnery positions. By war's end, virtually all bomber gunners had been trained in zone firing techniques. The early war emphasis on traditional marksmanship, breath control, sight picture, trigger squeeze, had been completely replaced by training in probability zones, position firing, and rate of fire maximization. The material impact was equally staggering. American industry produced over 1.5 billion rounds of .50 caliber ammunition during the war, much of it expended in zone firing over Europe and the Pacific. The average B-17 carried 11,000 rounds on a typical mission. During major raids involving hundreds of bombers, American gunners could put over 20 million bullets into the air in a single day. It was industrial warfare at its most literal, the mass production of probability delivered at 2,800 feet per second. The Pacific Theater provided the final validation of statistical gunnery. B-29 superfortresses attacking Japan faced a different challenge than B-17S over Germany. Japanese fighters, generally lighter and more maneuverable than their German counterparts, used different attack techniques. Yet the zone firing principles proved equally effective. The centralized fire control system of the B-29, combined with radar-directed guns, created probability zones that Japanese pilots found impossible to penetrate. Major Saburo Sakai, Japan's leading surviving ace with 64 confirmed victories, described attacking B-29s in early 1945. It was like flying into a mathematical equation. The Americans hadn't just mechanized aerial gunnery, they had reduced it to pure mathematics. They calculated every possible approach angle and filled it with bullets. There was no path through based on skill or courage. Only luck could get you past their statistics. We weren't fighting men anymore. We were fighting probability itself. The final statistics tell the story of transformation. In August 1943, before the adoption of zone firing, the 8th Air Force was losing bombers at an unsustainable rate, over 10% per mission during the Schweinfurt-Regensburg raids, with some groups suffering 50% losses. Gunners were claiming hundreds of German fighters destroyed, but actually shooting down fewer than 1 in 10 of their claims. By spring 1945, using fully developed statistical gunnery techniques, loss rates had dropped to under 1% per mission, despite continued German opposition. American gunners, who had been achieving hit rates of 0.5% in 1943, were achieving rates approaching 5% by 1945, a tenfold improvement based entirely on abandoning traditional marksmanship for statistical engagement. The transformation was complete and irreversible. American gunners had stopped firing at what they could see and started firing at what probability predicted. They had abandoned the romance of marksmanship for the reality of mathematics. They had discovered that in modern aerial warfare at jet-age speeds, statistics beat skill, probability beat precision, and mathematics beat marksmanship. They had learned to stop aiming and trust the zones, to cease tracking and trust the calculations, to abandon everything they believed about combat and trust the numbers. The boys who had gone to war in 1942 believing in the power of a well-aimed shot came home in 1945 understanding that modern combat was ruled by statistical inevitability. They had traded their identities as warriors for roles as probability implementers. They had exchanged the satisfaction of individual victory for the effectiveness of mathematical certainty. And in that transformation, they had helped win the air war over Europe, proving that sometimes the most counterintuitive solution is the most effective, that abandoning everything you believe about combat might be the key to victory, and that in the age of industrial warfare, mathematics had become the deadliest weapon of all. These young Americans had participated in one of the most profound military transformations in history, a revolution that would echo through the decades in every computer-controlled weapons system, every automated defense network, every algorithm-driven military technology. They had proven that in the modern age, victory belonged not to the best marksman, but to those who best understood and applied the cold, impartial equations of probability. They had turned warfare from an art into a science, from a contest of individual skills into a problem of statistical optimization. And in doing so, they had not just won a war, but transformed the very nature of combat itself, ushering in an age where mathematics would increasingly determine the outcome of battles, where computers would replace human judgment, and where statistical probability would become the ultimate arbiter of life and death in the skies above the battlefield.